Post-apocalypse. His food stall becomes the only hope for hungry alien women. The once vibrant world of Proxima 9 was now a desolate wasteland. The twin suns, red and blood orange, hung low in the sky, casting an eternal twilight over the landscape. The air was thick with dust, remnants of a war that had ravaged the planet, turning a thriving colony into a barren ruin. The soil, tainted by years of conflict, could barely support life, and the sky, forever choked by smoke and ash, refused to clear. The peace that had once graced this world was now a distant memory. Amidst the chaos, Morgan Reed stood on a small hill overlooking what remained of a once thriving settlement. At 35, he was a survivor, built like a warrior, with broad shoulders, a strong jawline, and dark blonde hair that always seemed untamed. His muscles rippled under his worn green vest as he wiped the sweat from his brow. The air was hot and dry, but he didn't mind. He had spent the past year learning how to live with it. Morgan wasn't just any survivor, though. He was the last of his kind in this part of the galaxy, a human in a world populated by aliens. For months, he had been alone in this small part of Proxima 9, scavenging for supplies, fixing what was broken, and getting by on whatever he could find. But today, something different was in the air. Today, he was going to try something that hadn't been done since the war. He stepped back from his work, inspecting the sign he had just nailed into place. Reed's Eats, open for business. The words were simple, scrawled hastily, but they carried weight. It was the first food stall to open on this planet since the war. Morgan wasn't foolish enough to think he could revive the world with food alone, but he knew one thing for sure: everyone needs to eat. And if he could feed someone, even just one person, it would mean something. Maybe it would remind people of what life used to be like before everything turned to ash. His stall was basic, just a makeshift counter, a couple of cooking surfaces, and a small supply of food. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. It was the best he could do with what he had. A portable fusion generator hummed quietly beside him, powering his equipment, its blue light flickering in the fading orange glow of the sky. "You're insane, you know that," a voice called out from behind him. Morgan turned, squinting into the distance where the voice had come from. A figure was leaning against a twisted metal beam, the shadow of a man against the dusty sky. It was Kel, the only other human Morgan had seen in months. Kel was older, much older, his face weathered and scarred by the harsh conditions of the world they had inherited. His eyes were tired, but there was a sharpness to them, a remnant of the man he used to be. "I know," Morgan replied with a grin, not even bothering to look away from his stall. "But insanity is a luxury in short supply these days." Kel shook his head and approached, his boots crunching on the ground. "Opening a food stall in the middle of nowhere? The locals can barely afford to breathe, let alone eat." Morgan didn't look up from his work as he adjusted the small cooking equipment on the counter. "Everyone's gotta eat, Kel. Even broke folks." "Broke folks, huh?" Kel snorted. "You know these folks aren't human, right?" Morgan finally turned to face him, a smirk playing on his lips. "Humanoid enough," he said, gesturing to the settlement below. It was a ragged mess of shanties, scavenged debris, and broken structures. Despite the devastation, there were signs of life, alien life. Various species roamed the streets, their eyes hollow from hunger and years of survival. "I've studied their digestive systems. They can process most of what I cook." Kel crossed his arms, skeptical. "And how do you plan to get paid, huh? Credits are worthless out here." Morgan's eyes hardened slightly as he busied himself with preparing the first batch of food. "I'll figure something out. Barter, trade. I'm not here to make a fortune. I'm here to feed people." Kel let out a low sigh, clearly unconvinced. "I don't know, Morgan. You're the only human for light years, and from the looks of it, these aliens are mostly women. You're built like a damn hero from those old vids. You don't think they'll start offering you other things in exchange for food?" Morgan didn't look up as he continued to work, but the thought lingered in his mind. The desperation of these creatures was palpable, but he wasn't here for anything like that. "I'm not interested in that kind of trade," he said firmly. Kel raised an eyebrow. "Noble. Just watch yourself, okay? Desperation makes people do crazy things, even non-people." Morgan nodded absently, more focused on the small flame flickering to life on one of his cooking surfaces. He had no intention of becoming part of their desperate barter system, but he knew the hunger in their eyes. and it was only a matter of time before they came to him. He didn't know what to expect, but he wasn't afraid. His hands were steady, his resolve unshaken. Kel, seeing that the conversation was going nowhere, turned and began walking back toward the settlement. Well, good luck with that. I'll be around if you change your mind about that insanity thing. Morgan watched him go, but his attention was quickly drawn back to the food stall. The first customer was arriving. She was thin, skin stretched tight over bones, and her blue skin looked almost translucent in the dying light. Her large, weary eyes scanned the counter warily, and she hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. Her hands were empty, and the hunger in her gaze was enough to stop Morgan's breath for a moment. "Is this food?" she asked in halting standard. Her voice cracked from thirst and lack of nourishment. Morgan's smile was genuine as he stepped forward. "Yes, ma'am. What can I get you?" The alien seemed startled by his friendliness, as though she hadn't expected to find such kindness in a world that had forgotten it. She placed something on the counter, a small, mechanical component, nothing more than a useless piece of tech in the hands of most people. But Morgan's eyes scanned it, recognizing its value. "I don't have credits," she said quietly, her voice a mix of shame and desperation. "But I have this power converter. It still works." Morgan nodded, understanding. It was more than a meal, and it wasn't a simple trade. It was an opportunity to build something more. With a nod, he turned to the stove. "Then you'll get more than one meal," he said. "Sit down. I'll fix you something good." As she sat down and waited, Morgan couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about connecting with the lost souls around him, feeding them both physically and emotionally. And perhaps, in doing so, he could build something better from the ashes of this war-torn world. He set the pot on the stove, stirring as the stew began to take shape, and for the first time in a long while, Morgan Reed allowed himself to believe in the impossible. There was hope here, even in the darkest of places. And maybe, just maybe, his stall would become the spark of something much bigger. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, and Morgan's eyes flicked toward the horizon. He knew this was just the beginning. The wind howled across Proxima 9's barren landscape, whipping up dust and debris that swirled in the dim twilight. Morgan Reed's food stall, small and humble, sat at the crest of a hill, a beacon of light in an otherwise hopeless world. The strange, orange glow from the twin suns cast long shadows, and the soft hum of his portable fusion generator was the only sound that cut through the eerie silence. Morgan's first customer had arrived, a thin, blue-skinned alien woman, hungry and desperate. She had offered a mechanical component in exchange for food, and Morgan, without hesitation, had accepted. He wasn't sure what had drawn him to open this food stall in the first place. Perhaps it was a sense of duty. Perhaps, somewhere deep down, he simply wanted to do something that could help. People were starving, not just from hunger, but from the loneliness and despair that had swept across the colony since the war. Maybe, just maybe, food could do more than just sustain the body. It could heal the broken spirit. As Morgan finished preparing the stew for the blue-skinned woman, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. A group of aliens, mostly women, had started gathering at the base of the hill, drawn in by the smell of something familiar, something warm and comforting. The word had already spread through the settlement. Morgan's food stall was no longer just a stall. It had become a symbol of survival, of human ingenuity, and of hope. The blue-skinned woman had already eaten her fill, her mechanical component exchanged for more than just food, a small gesture of kindness. She stood up, nodded at Morgan with silent gratitude, and left without a word. It was a moment that seemed to pass in slow motion, but Morgan knew something had shifted. "Next," he called, his voice carrying across the dusty air. One by one, the alien women approached the stall, each bringing their own form of barter, a piece of scrap tech, a broken weapon, some salvageable parts from the wreckage of past battles. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time in months, Morgan had found himself in the role of provider, something he had never imagined he'd be doing on a planet like Proxima 9. The stall, which had started as a simple survival tactic, was slowly becoming the heart of this small settlement. Each transaction was more than just an exchange of goods. It was a brief moment of human connection in a place where relationships were as scarce as water. As he handed out food and accepted whatever the aliens had to offer, Morgan couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose growing within him. It was small, yes, but it was a start. The next person in line caught Morgan's attention immediately. She was different from the others. While the others had been thin, wearing clothes that had seen better days, this woman stood tall and proud, her emerald green skin gleaming under the light of the twin suns. Her hair, long and silver, shimmered like moonlight, and her eyes, violet, almost glowing, locked with his from across the stall. There was something about her that felt otherworldly, but at the same time, strangely familiar. She didn't approach right away. Instead, she watched him from a distance, sizing him up, as if studying him for something more than just food. Her gaze held an intensity, a quiet power, that sent a shiver down Morgan's spine. Morgan wasn't sure what to make of her, but he knew one thing. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't here out of desperation. No, there was something else. Something that told him that, somehow, this woman was important. "Can I help you?" Morgan asked, trying to sound casual, though his voice betrayed a flicker of curiosity. The woman finally stepped forward, her movements graceful, almost like she was floating above the ground. She didn't speak immediately, but when she did, her voice was melodic, almost musical, the kind of voice that felt like it belonged to an ancient, powerful race. "I have no credits to offer," she said, her accent making the words sound like a song. "But I have something else." Morgan frowned slightly, not sure what to expect. But when she placed a small, intricately carved crystal on the counter, his eyes widened. The crystal seemed to pulse faintly with an inner light. He could feel something powerful about it, though he couldn't quite place what. "What is this?" Morgan asked, reaching for it. The woman met his gaze, her violet eyes unwavering. "A warning." Morgan raised an eyebrow, unsure of what she meant. "A warning. The Virex clan is planning to raid your supplies tonight. They'll come in force, armed with sonic disruptors. I suggest you prepare." Her voice was calm, almost too calm, like she had seen far worse and had learned how to deal with it. Morgan was silent for a moment, processing her words. The Virex clan. He had heard the name in passing, but he didn't know much about them. From what he had gathered, they were ruthless. A band of mercenaries who had taken advantage of the post-war chaos to claim whatever they could. And now, it seemed, they had set their sights on his food stall. "Why are you telling me this?" Morgan asked, his tone guarded. She shrugged slightly, as if it was of no particular consequence to her. "Because you feed people without asking for more than they can give. It's honorable." Morgan's gaze softened. "I don't expect much in return," he said quietly. "Just enough to keep this place going." The woman, whose name was revealed to be Syra, smiled. "That is rare," she said, stepping back slightly. "Most of my kind would take advantage. But you are different." Her eyes met his once again, and this time, Morgan felt a strange jolt of something, a connection, an understanding that went beyond words. Without another word, Syra turned to leave, but not before she added, "Prepare yourself. The Virex will be here soon." And with that, she disappeared into the shadows, leaving Morgan to consider what she had said. The settlement was about to face a test. The Virex clan was coming, and Morgan would have to be ready. But as he stood there, staring at the spot where Syra had been moments before, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. This food stall, this humble operation, had somehow become more than a source of food. It had become a symbol. And Morgan Reed, despite the danger that was closing in on him, was beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, he could do more than just survive. Maybe he could change things. Maybe he could even change the future of this broken world. But first, he had to survive the night. And with the Virex on the way, survival was going to take more than just food. It was going to take everything he had. The sun dipped lower, casting the already crimson sky into a deeper shade of red. Proxima 9 had no true night. The constant dust storms ensured the planet never saw the stars, only the harsh light of the twin suns. Morgan stood at his stall, his mind racing with the words of Syra. The Virex clan, this raiding group that Syra had warned him about, was coming, and Morgan wasn't sure if he was ready for it. His small food stall, which had only just begun to thrive after months of struggle, could easily be destroyed in a single attack. And yet, there was something about the alien woman that felt different. Her warning, her calm presence, her eyes that seemed to know more than she was letting on. What was her game? Morgan glanced around, his mind already on high alert. The makeshift settlement stretched below him, a collection of ramshackle structures pieced together from the wreckage of old ships and military tech. The ground was rough, the dirt baked under the oppressive heat, and the few remaining structures sagged in defeat. Still, it was home to those who had survived the aftermath of the war, and it was where Morgan had found his purpose again. With the Virex clan on the way, things were about to change. He began preparing his stall for the evening, not knowing what to expect. Word had already spread. Morgan's food stall had become more than just a place to eat. For some, it had become a refuge. For others, it was a last hope. It wasn't long before his first customers began to trickle in. A few women, their skin various shades of blue, green, and purple, some with translucent scales, others with sharp, reptilian features. They came to the counter, each offering whatever they could to pay for a meal. Some brought scrap parts from old wrecks, others traded memories of distant wars. But as Morgan served them, he couldn't help but notice a shift in their demeanor. There was a quiet tension in the air, a subtle urgency. The alien women, once quiet and submissive, were now talking in hushed whispers. A glance here, a pointed finger there. They were on edge. It didn't take long for Morgan to realize they had heard the same warning he had. The Virex clan was coming. A thin woman with jet-black skin and pale yellow eyes approached the counter. Her hands were empty, but she had a calmness about her that immediately struck Morgan. She was older than most, her face lined with the signs of age and hardship. "You know about the Virex?" she asked quietly, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid someone might hear her. Her voice was low, with a gravelly edge to it. Morgan nodded, not wanting to reveal too much. "I heard." She studied him for a moment, then slid a small, faded map onto the counter. "They're coming from the east," she said, "and they're bringing more than just sonic disruptors. You need to fortify your defenses, Reed. They're ruthless. They don't just take what they need. They destroy everything else." Morgan's brow furrowed. "I've got some defenses. Nothing fancy, but it'll do." The woman gave him a skeptical look. "That won't be enough. Trust me." She paused for a moment, then leaned in closer. "You're not just feeding us, Reed. You've become a symbol. People are watching you. If you go down, so does everyone else." Morgan swallowed hard. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time since he set up the stall, he realized just how much responsibility he had taken on. More than just food. He was now a leader in this small settlement, whether he liked it or not. And if the Virex clan came, he would have to protect not only his stall but the people who relied on it. "Thanks for the heads up," he said, his voice steady. "I'll be ready." The woman nodded, then turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Morgan alone with his thoughts. He stared at the map she had left, tracing the crude markings with his finger. It showed the path the Virex clan would take, the settlements they would pass, and the points where they might make their attack. As Morgan turned the map over, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A small, detailed drawing etched into the back of the map. It was a symbol, a crest of sorts. It looked like a combination of a serpent and an eagle, twisted into an emblem that looked both ancient and alien. It was clear it meant something, but what? His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of hurried footsteps. A woman, shorter than most of the others, with green skin and wide, nervous eyes, rushed up to the counter, holding a small bundle of supplies in her hands. Her breath was shallow, her chest heaving with anxiety. I'm sorry, I don't have much to offer, but can you spare some food?" she asked in a trembling voice. "I've heard what's coming. My family needs to be ready." Morgan looked at her, his instincts kicking in. The woman was terrified, and rightfully so. The Virex clan would take everything. Everyone who wasn't strong enough to defend themselves would be left with nothing. He glanced down at the food he had left, just enough for a few more customers, but no more. He hesitated. It would have been easy to turn her away, to tell her there was nothing left. But something inside him pushed him to do the right thing. He smiled gently and handed her a bowl of stew. "Take it. It's on the house," he said softly. "But you need to get out of here. Head north. It's safer up there. You'll find others who can help." The woman blinked in surprise. You're sure? You don't even know me." "I know you need it," Morgan said, his voice firm. "That's enough for me." With a mixture of gratitude and relief, the woman took the food and hurried away, disappearing into the crowd. Morgan stared after her, feeling a strange sense of pride. He was doing more than just surviving now. He was giving something. It wasn't much, but it was the most he could do. The settlement had become something more than just a place for people to survive. It had become a community, and Morgan was at the heart of it. But as he turned to prepare for the next customer, a shadow passed over him. He could feel the eyes of the others on him, watching, waiting. The Virex clan was coming, and Morgan Reed was ready to face them, not as a cook, but as something much more, a protector, a leader, and a symbol of hope in a world that had forgotten both. The sky over Proxima 9 was a constant blood-orange haze, but tonight it seemed darker than usual. A chill swept over the settlement as the sun dipped lower, casting long, eerie shadows over the cracked earth. Morgan Reed stood at his food stall, watching the horizon, his mind running through the scenarios. Syra's warning echoed in his mind. The Virex are coming. He wasn't sure if he could handle them on his own. No, he wasn't alone anymore. The past few days had shown him something he hadn't expected. The people here were starting to believe in something bigger than just survival. They were beginning to believe in each other. The food stall had become more than just a place to eat. It had become a hub, a place where the last remnants of Proxima 9's community came together. But that fragile peace was about to be shattered by the Virex clan, and Morgan knew that he had to prepare. His first instinct had been to make do with what he had, set up a few defenses, perhaps an alarm system, and rely on the small armory of weapons he had scavenged. But as he looked down at his meager setup, he knew it wouldn't be enough. Not by a long shot. The Virex clan were known for their brutal raids, ruthless and well-coordinated. They wouldn't just walk in. They would tear down everything in their path. They had done it before, and they would do it again. But Morgan wasn't going to let that happen. Not this time. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed help. He needed a plan. He set to work, going through his supplies and inventory. His small food stall, once a solitary outpost, was now surrounded by the fractured settlement. He had a good vantage point from here, a hilltop where he could see everything coming. But he also knew that a single person, or even a small group, could easily be overwhelmed if they weren't prepared. The sound of footsteps pulled him out of his thoughts, and he turned to see Syra approaching again, her silver hair shining even in the fading light. Her eyes, violet and intense, met his with an unspoken understanding. She didn't need to ask what was on his mind. She already knew. "Virex coming?" she asked, her voice calm, but with a sharp edge that hinted at experience. Morgan nodded, his hands clenching into fists. "Yeah, I don't know what to expect, but I'm going to need more than just food to survive this." Syra's gaze softened slightly, though there was still a fierce resolve in her eyes. "You're not the only one who's been preparing." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She motioned for him to follow, leading him to the edge of the hill where the settlement stretched out below them. The few structures that remained looked like ruins, rotting foundations of a world that had been torn apart by war. But it wasn't just the buildings that had been affected. The people, too, were scarred by years of surviving. They had become hardened, resourceful, and determined. They had no choice. "There are more of us here than you think," Syra said quietly, her eyes scanning the settlement below. "We're all survivors, and we know how to fight." Morgan followed her gaze, his mind already racing with possibilities. The settlers, alien and human alike, had been struggling to get by, each day a battle. But if they could unite against the Virex, if they could fight together, they might stand a chance. "You're suggesting we all fight?" he asked. Syra turned to face him, her gaze unwavering. "Not just fight. Prepare." She led him to the center of the settlement, where a few of the local women had begun to gather. They were talking in hushed voices, exchanging glances, preparing for what was coming. Morgan had noticed these same women over the past few days, quiet, determined, and more than willing to help, despite their desperate circumstances. Now, they were rallying together, forming a plan. As he approached, one of them, a tall woman with iridescent blue scales, stepped forward. Her name was Alara, and Morgan had seen her several times at his stall. She was a scavenger, quick, resourceful, and strong. But there was something more about her now. She wasn't just trying to survive anymore. She was ready to fight. "You heard the news?" Alara asked, her voice low and steady. "About the Virex?" Morgan nodded. "I heard. They're coming for us." Alara glanced around, making sure no one was listening too closely. We've been preparing for a while. The settlement might be small, but we've got our strengths. People here know how to fight back, and we're willing to. Morgan looked around at the others. There were a few men, but mostly women, tough, resourceful, and used to surviving on scraps. They weren't soldiers, but they had lived through the war. They had been forced to become something more than just survivors. They had become fighters, whether they wanted to or not. I need your help, Morgan said, his voice firm. I can't protect this place alone. I need you to help me set up defenses, to organize the people. Alara nodded without hesitation. We'll do what we can. But it's not just about defenses. It's about trust. If we're going to win this, we need to trust each other. Cyrus stepped in, her voice calm but insistent. Morgan's right. If we're going to stand a chance against the V-Rex, we need to be organized. We need to know what we're fighting for. Morgan felt a surge of determination rise within him. For the first time since he'd set foot on Proxima 9, he wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for something bigger. He wasn't alone anymore. The settlers, this ragtag group of survivors, had become something more than just people trying to scrape by. They had become a community, a family. And as he looked around at them, Morgan knew that together, they might just be able to take on the V-Rex. But he also knew it wouldn't be easy. The V-Rex weren't just a bunch of raiders. They were a well-trained, ruthless clan that had terrorized this world for far too long. If Morgan was going to protect his stall, his people, and the fragile peace they had built, he would have to do more than just cook. They were coming. The V-Rex were on their way. And Morgan Reed was ready to face them, not alone, but with the people he had come to protect. Night had fallen, but the oppressive blood-orange haze never truly lifted from Proxima 9. The dust clouds, remnants of a war that had torn this world apart, swirled in the air, caught in the ever-present twilight. Morgan Reed stood at the edge of his food stall, his heart pounding in his chest as the wind howled through the settlement below. The V-Rex were coming, and everything he had worked for was about to be tested. He glanced around at the makeshift barricades the settlers had set up. They weren't soldiers, but they had done their best. Some used metal scrap, others repurposed old vehicles and cargo crates. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They were ready. Morgan knew that, in this moment, his stall had become something more than a source of food. It had become the last line of defense for everyone here. Syra, who had been working alongside him in organizing the defenses, stepped up beside him. Her usual calm demeanor had shifted to something more intense, but there was still an unshakable resolve in her eyes. They're almost here, she said quietly, her voice carrying over the howling wind. She scanned the horizon, her violet eyes narrowing. We've got a few minutes before they make their move. Morgan nodded. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he didn't allow fear to take hold. Fear had no place here. This was about survival, about standing up for something that mattered. I've done what I can, he said, his voice low. The automated defenses are armed, and the barricades should hold for a while. We'll take them down before they get close. But we need to stay sharp. Siren nodded in agreement. I've sent scouts out to watch their approach. They'll come in from the east, just like we predicted. We'll have the advantage of the high ground. Morgan's eyes flicked toward the settlement. The women, alien and human alike, had gathered together, each standing in their designated positions. They were ready to fight, and despite the fear in their eyes, there was a quiet strength about them. The settlement, once a crumbling shell of its former self, had become a united front. They weren't going to be easy targets. But Morgan knew that even with all their preparation, the V-Rex clan was a force to be reckoned with. They were ruthless, well-armed, and accustomed to wiping out anyone who stood in their way. This wasn't going to be an easy fight. A distant rumble broke through the tension, sending a shiver down Morgan's spine. The V-Rex were close. He quickly turned to Syra. Get the others into position. We hold this line, no matter what. She didn't need another word. Syra turned on her heel and moved swiftly through the settlement, her silver hair gleaming in the dim light. Morgan watched her go, his chest tight with anticipation. He knew she was more than just an ally. She was a warrior in her own right. Together, they would face whatever came next. Morgan adjusted his vest, checking his pulse rifle one last time. The weapon was a relic, a military-grade model scavenged from the wreckage of the war. It wasn't the best tool for the job, but it was what he had. He'd make it work. The first signs of movement came from the east. A cloud of dust kicked up, and through the haze, Morgan could make out the dark shapes of the V-Rex raiders. They were coming in fast, too fast. Morgan's pulse quickened as he turned to face the barricade. His eyes locked onto the nearest position, where Alara, the blue-scaled scavenger, was already taking aim. She had a makeshift crossbow, her steady hands poised to fire. A few of the other settlers had armed themselves with anything they could find: broken weapons, salvaged tech, and even homemade explosives. They weren't soldiers, but they knew how to fight for survival. Syra returned to Morgan's side, her eyes sharp. "They're sending in scouts first," she said. "We need to hit them fast, before they bring in the full force." Morgan nodded, his heart thudding in his chest. This was it. No turning back now. He signaled to the others. "Hold your fire until I say." The V-Rex scouts were getting closer, their dark, armored figures emerging from the dust. They were moving with precision, their eyes scanning for any signs of weakness. They were too organized, too well-trained, and Morgan's stomach twisted with the realization that they had been underestimated. But he wasn't going to let them take this settlement without a fight. "Now!" Morgan yelled, his voice cutting through the wind. The sound of gunfire erupted as the settlers opened fire. Alara's crossbow bolts flew through the air, striking one of the V-Rex scouts in the chest. The scout crumpled, but the others didn't hesitate. They dove for cover, returning fire with weapons that fired in loud, sharp bursts. Sonic disruptors. Morgan's pulse rifle cracked to life, and he fired, his shots finding their mark. A V-Rex scout dropped, but there were too many. The rest of the V-Rex advanced, their movements calculated, relentless. Morgan dove behind one of the barricades, pulling Syra down beside him. "They're not slowing down," he muttered, his voice tight with urgency. Syra's expression was grim. "We can't hold out forever. They've got heavier firepower coming. We need to get to the high ground." Before Morgan could respond, the first of the V-Rex's heavy artillery arrived. A massive warbot, half scrap, half weapon, came barreling through the dust, its giant legs stomping the earth with each step. The automated turrets Morgan had set up began firing, their rounds ricocheting off the warbot's heavy armor. But it barely slowed. "Alara," Morgan shouted. "You've got that rocket launcher, right?" Alara nodded, her expression fierce. "I do. Take that thing down." Now, Alara sprinted toward a high point where the warbot's weak spots were exposed, and with a grunt, she fired. The rocket soared through the air, striking the warbot's side. The explosion sent a shockwave through the settlement, and for a brief moment, Morgan thought they might have done it. But the warbot staggered, but didn't fall. It continued its relentless march forward, its guns aimed at the barricades. "We need to move," Syra shouted, pulling Morgan to his feet. But it was too late. The V-Rex had breached the first line of defenses. More soldiers were pouring in from the sides, flanking the settlement from all angles. The settlers, though brave, were struggling to hold their ground. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, and Morgan's heart sank as a massive V-Rex warship descended from the sky, its dark, sleek hull cutting through the smoke and dust like a predator on the hunt. It was the final wave of their assault, and it was going to take everything Morgan had to survive. But he wasn't going down without a fight. Not now. Not ever. "Everyone to the inner barricades," Morgan yelled, as he grabbed his pulse rifle, determination flooding through his veins. "We hold this ground." This battle wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about proving that humanity, and the people who fought beside him, would never give up, no matter the odds. The V-Rex were about to learn that Proxima 9 was no longer a planet of helpless survivors. It was a world where people stood together, and that, no matter how strong their enemies were, they would never back down. As the battle raged on, Morgan knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a fight for food. This was a fight for their future, and he was ready to face whatever came next. The settlement was in chaos. The air was thick with smoke, the crackle of gunfire echoing off the shattered buildings. The settlers, their makeshift weapons in hand, had fought valiantly, but Morgan could feel the weight of the V-Rex forces pressing in on them. Despite their courage, they were outgunned, outnumbered, and fighting an enemy with superior firepower. The heavy V-Rex warbot still lumbered forward, its massive body slowly crushing the barricades beneath its iron feet. Morgan's pulse raced as he ducked behind a stack of metal debris, firing his pulse rifle toward the advancing soldiers. His shots found their mark, but it was like throwing pebbles at a tidal wave. The V-Rex were relentless, and for every soldier that went down, 2 more took their place. "Alara," Morgan shouted, his voice cutting through the din of battle. "We need that rocket launcher now." The blue-scaled scavenger, sweat dripping from her brow, nodded in grim determination. She was already preparing her launcher, but there was no mistaking the fear in her eyes. Even with the rocket launcher, they were fighting an uphill battle. "I'm ready," Alara called back, but her voice wavered with uncertainty. "But I don't know how much longer we can hold them off." Morgan's mind raced. There had to be something else, a way to tip the scales in their favor. He looked toward Syra, who had positioned herself on a makeshift tower overlooking the battlefield. Her silver hair shimmered in the dim light, and despite the chaos around them, she seemed eerily calm. Her violet eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, they shared an unspoken understanding. "We need to end this," Syra said, her voice clear even over the chaos. "But to do that, we need to stop their supply line, cut off the V-Rex from getting reinforcements." Morgan nodded, catching her meaning immediately. "Where's the weak point?" he asked. Syra didn't hesitate. "The warship's landing zone. It's exposed. There's a fuel depot just past the ridge. They're using it to resupply their troops and warbits. If we can destroy it, the V-Rex won't have the resources to continue the fight." The idea was risky, but it was their only shot. The warship's firepower had already overwhelmed their defenses, and Morgan knew that if they didn't act fast, they would be completely overrun. He turned to the group of settlers, each one holding their ground with grim determination. "Listen up," Morgan shouted. "We've got one chance to stop them. Syra and I are going to take out their fuel depot. The rest of you need to hold the line and keep them occupied. Do you understand?" A chorus of nods and murmured agreement rippled through the group. They weren't soldiers, but they had become something more than just survivors. They were a community, and they weren't about to let their home fall without a fight. "We can do this," Alara said, her voice firm. "Just keep them off us while you go. We've got your back." Morgan didn't waste another second. He turned to Syra, who had already begun making her way toward the ridge. He followed closely behind, moving quickly through the rubble and debris, knowing every second counted. As they reached the base of the ridge, the sound of the V-Rex warship's engines thundered overhead, sending a wave of dust and debris into the air. They crouched low, staying out of sight, their eyes locked on the fuel depot in the distance. The V-Rex were scattered throughout the settlement, focused on overpowering the defenders. It was the perfect time for a strike. "We make it fast," Syra said quietly, her voice steady. "One shot, one chance." Morgan nodded, pulling the small explosive charge from his belt. It was a simple device, cobbled together from scavenged parts, but it was powerful. He could only hope it was enough to take out the depot. They moved swiftly, staying in the shadows, their footsteps muffled by the sound of distant explosions. As they neared the fuel depot, Morgan could see the V-Rex soldiers guarding it, unaware of their approach. The depot was a large, metal structure, its walls reinforced with thick armor. It was the key to their survival, and the V-Rex knew it. Morgan crept closer, his heart pounding in his chest. Syra moved beside him, her silver hair blending into the shadows. They reached the base of the depot, and Morgan quickly set the explosive charge, attaching it to the main fuel supply line. He gave it a quick glance, ensuring it was secure, then nodded to Syra. "Now," he whispered. Syra took a deep breath and fired a shot, her blaster cutting through the air with precision. The V-Rex soldiers guarding the depot barely had time to react before they were taken out by the force of her blast. The explosion echoed through the night as the fuel depot ignited, sending a burst of flame into the sky. The blast was so powerful that it rattled the ground beneath them, shaking the very foundations of the settlement. "Get down," Morgan shouted as debris rained down from the explosion, sending up clouds of dust and smoke. He grabbed Syra and pulled her to the ground, shielding her from the blast. The fireball illuminated the entire settlement, casting long shadows across the battlefield. The V-Rex warship groaned in protest as its engines sputtered, struggling to maintain altitude. The shockwave from the explosion had thrown its systems into disarray, and for a moment, it seemed to hover unsteadily in the sky. It was their opening. Morgan stood, pulling Syra up with him. They turned and raced back toward the settlement, the sound of the V-Rex warship's engines faltering in the distance. The settlers had heard the explosion and were rallying to the ridge, their confidence renewed by the blast. "We've got a chance," Morgan shouted, his voice full of adrenaline. "Keep pushing. Hold the line." As they made their way back, Morgan could see the settlers fighting with renewed strength. The V-Rex had been thrown into disarray, their reinforcements cut off, their warship crippled. The balance of power had shifted, but it wasn't over yet. The V-Rex were regrouping, pulling back into a defensive formation. They weren't giving up. They were still dangerous. Morgan and Syra arrived at the ridge, where Alara and the others were holding their ground. Morgan's heart swelled with pride at what they had accomplished. "The V-Rex are hurting," Alara said as she reloaded her crossbow. "But they're not done. We need to finish this." Morgan turned to Syra, his eyes fierce with determination. "We finish it together, once and for all." And with that, they charged back into the fray, ready to put an end to the V-Rex's reign of terror on Proxima 9. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for a future, for a new hope, and for the strength of a community that would never back down. The dust settled, but the battle raged on. Morgan stood on the ridge, watching the aftermath of the explosion. The V-Rex warship, crippled but still in the air, hovered unsteadily above the settlement. Its hull was pocked with burn marks, and thick, black smoke billowed from its engines. The blast from the fuel depot had done its job, but it wasn't enough to destroy the enemy entirely. The warship was still operational, and the V-Rex soldiers, though thrown into disarray, were regrouping, adapting. They weren't going to give up easily. Morgan's heart pounded as he scanned the horizon. The settlement had held its ground so far, but he knew this wasn't over. The V-Rex had one thing going for them, their sheer determination. And now, they were furious. Beside him, Syra steadied her blaster, her silver hair blowing in the wind, eyes scanning the battlefield. She didn't speak, but Morgan knew what she was thinking. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about taking control of their future. The settlers, who had once been broken and scattered, had come together in ways he hadn't thought possible. But now, that unity was going to be tested like never before. "We hold this ground," Morgan said, his voice firm. Syra nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "We don't give them the chance to regroup. We push forward." Now, with a roar, the settlers rallied around Morgan and Syra. They weren't soldiers. They weren't even equipped to fight the V-Rex on equal terms. But they had something far more dangerous, the will to survive, and the strength of a community that had endured more than anyone should have to. Alara, her crossbow in hand, led the charge down the ridge, her eyes steely with determination. Behind her, the other settlers followed, shouting, rallying to her side. They were fighting for more than just food, more than just survival. They were fighting for their lives, for their homes, for the new future they had forged in the ashes of a broken world. Morgan joined them, his pulse rifle raised, eyes focused on the nearest group of V-Rex soldiers who had begun to reorganize on the outskirts of the settlement. They were moving with military precision, setting up barriers of their own, their weapons trained on the settlers. It was clear they had underestimated the people of Proxima 9, but now they were ready to fight back. "Move," Morgan shouted, as he took aim and fired, the pulse rifle's energy bolts cutting through the air. The V-Rex soldiers scattered, but not before returning fire, their weapons humming with deadly intent. Syra fired beside him, her shots accurate and unyielding, as the settlers pushed forward, taking cover behind rocks and wreckage. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were fighting. But the warship wasn't finished yet. It tilted dangerously to one side, its remaining engines sputtering as the V-Rex commander, Fax, emerged from the hatch, towering over the battlefield. He was a hulking figure, his reptilian eyes glowing with rage, and his voice booming as he commanded the remaining forces. "You will fall," Fax roared, his voice carrying across the ridge. "You will all fall before the might of the V-Rex." Morgan's grip on his rifle tightened, but there was no fear in his heart, only determination. The battle had reached its peak. There was no retreat. There was only victory or death. "Everyone, focus on the warship," Morgan yelled. "We end this now." The settlers, despite their fear, responded with unshakable resolve. Alara fired another bolt from her crossbow, striking a V-Rex soldier in the chest. One by one, the enemy fell, but Thax's forces continued to push forward, using their superior weapons and firepower to gain ground. Then, a flash of movement caught Morgan's eye. He turned to see Syra moving forward alone, her silhouette cutting through the dust and smoke. Without hesitation, she sprinted toward the warship, her blaster raised, firing as she ran. The V-Rex soldiers were too distracted by the settlers' assault to notice her approach. Morgan's heart skipped a beat as he realized what she was doing. She wasn't just taking down soldiers. She was aiming for the warship itself. "No!" Morgan shouted, rushing forward, but it was too late. Syra had already reached the warship, her blaster aimed directly at its exposed underbelly. With one final shot, the blast tore through the hull, sending a shockwave that rocked the entire settlement. The warship's systems sparked and sputtered, its engines overloaded by the impact. The V-Rex soldiers, caught in the blast, were thrown back, their lines broken as the warship began to plummet toward the ground. With a deafening crash, the warship struck the earth, sending debris flying in every direction. The force of the explosion sent Morgan tumbling to the ground, his ears ringing from the blast. He struggled to his feet, eyes scanning the wreckage as the smoke cleared. The warship was down. The V-Rex forces were in disarray. But the battle wasn't over yet. Thax, the V-Rex commander, stood at the center of the destruction, his eyes filled with fury. He bellowed a roar that shook the ground beneath them, but Morgan could see the fear in his eyes now. The V-Rex were on the brink of defeat, and this was their last stand. For Proxima 9, Morgan shouted, charging forward. He didn't need to look back to know that the settlers were with him. Their cries of defiance echoed across the battlefield as they moved to finish what they had started. Thax met Morgan at the center of the wreckage, his massive form looming over him. The two clashed, their weapons sparking as they locked in combat. Morgan's pulse rifle clicked empty, but he wasn't going to give up now. He lunged forward, tackling Thax to the ground with a strength that surprised even him. They rolled through the dust, struggling for control, but Morgan's resolve never wavered. With one final, desperate push, he grabbed the V-Rex commander's throat, squeezing until Thax's breath stopped. The battle was over. Morgan stood above Thax's lifeless body, gasping for air, his body covered in dirt and blood. But it didn't matter. They had won. The V-Rex were defeated. Proxima 9 had been saved. The survivors slowly emerged from their hiding spots, their faces a mix of exhaustion and triumph. Morgan turned to Syra, who stood a few paces behind him, watching the aftermath with a quiet, knowing smile. She had been the spark that had ignited the rebellion. She had shown them that it was possible to stand against the darkness. Morgan walked over to her, his heart pounding, his hands trembling with the weight of everything they had just endured. "We did it," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "We really did it." Syra smiled softly, her eyes gleaming with a quiet satisfaction. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You did it. You led them, Morgan. You gave them hope." Morgan looked around at the shattered remains of the battlefield, the bodies of the V-Rex strewn across the ground, and the settlers standing victorious. He had given them more than just food. He had given them the strength to fight, the courage to stand together. And that was all he needed to know.